Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may happen to be in the world. Thank you so much for joining the Spring and Pivotal webinar program again. We're excited to have you back. And I am your MC, as always, Peter Humphrey, and I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing lead committer for the Spring Boot project to celebrate our Spring Boot 2.0 release, Phil Webb from Pivotal, and we are also joined during the question and answer by Spring Boot team members Madhura Bave and Andy Wilkinson. So Phil, I know I told you I'd help you out with slides today, but you're not using any slides. So
no, not today.
Yeah, so this is pretty awesome. This is your typical rock star performance that you've done at Spring One. So we're excited to have you, and thanks for being willing to do this. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the release and things that have got you excited?
Yeah, so we've just cut Spring Boot 2.0. There's kind of not too many issues, which is pretty good. We're planning to do a 2.01 in the next couple of weeks or so. Things seem to be generally going okay. I've got lots to show you in this presentation, so it's going to take about an hour, and I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to start with the Spring Boot 1.5 application and try and show you the steps that you need to follow if you want to upgrade it to Spring Boot 2, and then we're going to move that app forwards and actually make it into a fully reactive application using WebFlux.
That sounds awesome, but I mean, I've heard that people only needed to know that we support ASCII animated art banners in order to make the business case
that's
for the
not
upgrade.
in the demo. I've decided against doing that. It felt like it was just too good to share on a webinar. You have to see that live, I'm afraid.
I hear you. I totally hear you. You got to come to Spring One for that one. All right, Phil. Well, please take it away.
Okay. Right. So what I've got here, I said earlier, is I'm going to start with a Spring Boot 1.5 application. So I've just got a really kind of simple application with just enough moving parts to kind of show some of the issues that you're likely to face when you upgrade. So let's start by looking at the POM. So you can see here we are on Spring Boot 1.5.10 release, and we have a few dependencies. We're using Spring Boot Starter Web, which is going to give us Tomcat and Spring MVC. We have the actuator, which is going to give us sort of metrics and monitoring and all that good stuff. We are using security, and we also have MongoDB as our backend database. And the reason I've picked MongoDB is because MongoDB is one of the few that we have actually got reactive support for. So there's about 3 or 4 that we have reactive support. There's reactive drivers available. So Mongo makes a good choice for this demo. And what else have we got? We've got this flapdoodle thing, which gives us embedded Mongo, which just means I don't have to bother installing it. And then some test dependencies, which we won't actually be using today. And then at the bottom, we also have the Spring Boot Maven plugin and a git commit plugin that's just going to give us some git char information when we run this app. Okay, if we have a quick look at the code, just so you're familiar with the application. So we have webinar application, which is just a kind of entry point. Doesn't really do anything other than set up the Spring Boot shenanigans. So we have a Spring Boot annotation and a main method. We then have a couple of controller. So we then have some domain objects. So this city object here is a Mongo document, and it's just got 2 fields, name and country. And then we have a city repository, which is a Spring Data repository that's just giving us a couple of methods to get access to those Mongo documents. So we have find all, which will give us everything, and we have find by name, ignoring case, which will give us one city given its name. And then the only other kind of slightly unusual part of this application is we need to get data into this repository. So what I decided to do is I decided to use a YAML file. So here we have a list of cities. So this is the test data that we're going to populate the database with when it starts up. And I wanted to kind of make use of a class that is in Spring Boot 1.5 but isn't in Spring Boot 2, just to show you that depending on like how deeply you integrate with Spring Boot, there may be some kind of changes that you need to make with your code. So this is slightly atypical, but it kind of gives you an idea of things that you might need to change. So just looking at this file, we have load cities YAML. So this thing basically takes, this is a Spring framework class that lets you load YAML and make it look like a properties object. So this will load up that cities YAML file. Once we've got that in, we kind of adapt it to this mutable property sources thing. We add it to mutable property sources. We then use this relaxed data binder, which is a Spring Boot 1.5 concern, and we are binding the values that we got from the YAML to this object called cities, which we really just need to get a list of city objects out. So this is like a little bit convoluted and complicated, but it's done for a reason, so that when we upgrade, you can see the differences. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. This relaxed binder thing, if you've used configuration properties in the past, this is the class that's responsible for kind of setting those up when you run your application. So this is what Spring Boot 1.5 uses behind the scenes. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to update my ID right now. So if we run this app, hopefully it'll start. So I can show you a couple of endpoints we've got. This little view here is part of Firefox. It just presents the JSON in a nice way. So this is the raw JSON. This is the view that I'll kind of show most of the time. So you can see here we've got the cities being response if we like look for all of them, or if we want to look for like a single city, like say London, there's just a single piece of data. So not much to the app. Let me just show you one or two other things. The cities thing, we're doing a little bit of Java 8 style streaming and filtering, so we're only showing cities that are in the USA. Again, that's for a specific reason that I'll come on to later. And then if we have a quick look at the application properties, we can see we set up some application info, which is something that will appear in the actuator later. This is just some Mongo stuff. And then there are two settings here that we need to be concerned about. One is we set a password, so we don't have to keep remembering it. And the other is we're turning off basic security for the application, so that just our actuator endpoints need security. So if I go back over here and look at the info actuator endpoint, you'll see that one just works, and we get that information coming back out and the commit ID. And if I look at a security endpoint, an endpoint like env, it'll ask me for the details, and I can log in with user magic, and then I get my env endpoint. So this one is an example of an endpoint that shows you kind of all the properties that you've got set. Again, it's worth taking a quick note here that this JSON data, when we upgrade the application, you'll see that some of our formats have changed slightly for quite good reasons. But this one, you can see at the moment we just have like the properties are kind of grouped by property source, and we just kind of dump everything out. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So what I want to do now is take this app and upgrade it. So I'm going to stop it running. And I want to upgrade it to Spring Boot 2 to kind of show you the processes that you'll have to go through. So for most applications, if you're not doing kind of too much deep integration, hopefully it's just a case of changing this version number. So if you change the parent version, if we save that file, and look at our Maven dependencies, you'll see that's immediately upgraded both Spring Boot and all of the kind of third-party dependencies. So here we've got Tomcat 8528, which is the latest stable Tomcat. We've got Spring MVC 5, and we've got Spring Boot 2.0. However, we have got some compile time issues. So in this case, the first thing that's broken is the data binder. So I said I'd pick something that was going to cause us some pain, and in this case, it's the Relax Data Binder. So Relax Data Binder was a Spring Boot 1.5 class, and it built on Spring Framework's Data Binder, which was really used for binding objects that come in over the web mainly. And we wanted to kind of move away from that in Spring Boot 2 and pick something that was kind of better suited for our purpose of binding to configuration properties. So in Spring Boot 2 we have a new class, and it's called Binder. So what I need to do is make use of a new class called Binder. And of course there are like 1,000 binders in the class path, but the one I want is this. And Binder takes one or more configuration property sources. So a configuration property source is a special type of source that the binder needs, and you can either get a binder from the environment and we adapt all of the Spring property sources that you have, or you can create your own. So I'm going to just make use of a map one, which takes a map as a source and kind of presents it as something that this binder can use. And for the source, I'll just use the YAML that we had earlier. Okay. So that's our binder. And if we want to bind, we need to provide two things. Like there's a few overloaded versions, but basically we need to provide a name. So in this case, I want to bind cities. And then we need to provide a target. And a target is ultimately one of these bindable objects. So bindable gives us a way to describe the thing that you want to bind. And it's much more flexible than having to have a real instance of an object. So we can actually declare things like, in this case, I'm going to want a list of a particular class, and we can give it annotations or an existing value, etc. So I'm just going to say I want a bindable, and I want a list of cities. So city.class, and that's about it, I think. This object actually returns something called a bind result. So it doesn't return the bound object directly. It returns something that returns the object. So you can think of it as a bit like optional. If you've used Java 8 streams, it's a bit like optional. And you can see it gives us a bunch of methods. So we can say, did it bind successfully? We can do mapping functions to kind of convert it to something else. The like or else returns, but I'm just going to do get, which will return it if it was bound and throw an exception if it wasn't. And that should be enough, I think. We no longer need this kind of crazy class that described just the list. That can go away. And that's it. We should be compiling again. So my imports out. Okay. So a few more things about this binder. This binder currently, we've got it to work with the way that configuration properties currently work, but I said this is a lot more flexible in the design. So in the future, we're going to try and support things like Kotlin data classes, and possibly even have interfaces that you can define properties in, configuration properties, and it kind of creates them automatically without you needing to do quite so much getters and setters in your own code. Okay, so let's see if this thing runs. Okay, so it seems to start up, Spring Boot 2 release, which is good. Let's go back over here and have a look at our cities endpoint. And okay, so the first thing that's kind of interesting here is we're being asked to log in now, whereas previously we weren't. Okay, we'll log in with our user magic password. And then you can see here we're also getting, like, I can't log in because the credentials are bad. And if we go back to our console, we can actually see we've got one of these generated security passwords, which is a little bit strange, but okay, let's try that. Hit the cities endpoint again. Okay, so the app's kind of working. We've got data coming back, but clearly some things are a little bit off with it. So let's have a quick look back at the app and see what's going on. So with Spring Boot 2, we've taken the opportunity to kind of rationalize a lot of the properties. So we had quite a lot of properties that you could set, and we tended to pick a lot of top-level names for them, which kind of made things a little bit confusing. So what we've actually done, let me just update this to get rid of that error. What we've done in Boot 2 is taken the chance to kind of rename a few of them. And if you open your application properties, and if you've got an IDE that supports Spring Boot property metadata, you should see kind of you get some errors. So in this case, we've got like a couple of problems here. The security.basic enabled is telling me that security is no longer customizable, so that one's gone. Okay, we'll come back to that. And the user password is deprecated, and it's telling me that there's a different one to use instead. So we could obviously just fix these up. Like, it's pretty easy to just change these in the file, but if you've got like a big app, or if you're not using an IDE that's kind of giving you this information, you might want to kind of take a more gradual approach. So to help out with that, there's a new dependency that you can add to your project. So I'm just going to add that in now. So Spring Boot Properties Migrator is a little additional dependency that you can throw into your project. And if we run this application again without fixing those errors, this time you'll see a couple of things interesting happen. First of all, just make that bigger, we don't get a generated password, so it's kind of fixed it. But we are getting a couple of these warnings. So we are getting something logged out saying this property source, and it's telling us exactly which file it's in. And then this key and the line number that that key is on has been replaced with this value. So it's telling us not only that this has changed, but because this migrator has got some smarts about it, it's able to migrate for us. So for now, it's changed, dynamically changed this to this until we've had a chance to fix it. And then it's also telling us about the other one that's gone away, and it obviously can't do much about that.
Phil, could you show us the YAML file real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
So the YAML's kind of pretty straightforward. Let me bring it side by side with the binder just to show you the kind of logic that you've got. So the YAML is just like one key and a list of elements with the name, country, name, country, name, country. So the way that the binder works is this properties object here will end up with elements that look like this. Like it'll have cities naught dot name equals and cities naught dot country equals, and then like one, etc., etc. So that YAML gets actually flattened out into a property structure, and then the binder basically says, okay, I want a list of cities, so that kind of maps to the list YAML. And then if you look at the city, there's setters for like set name, set country. So the binder basically will create one city for each element in the list and then call set name, set country, etc.
Awesome, thanks. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. I want to highlight something else that's kind of nice about this this migrator thing, which is a new feature that is kind of subtle, but you'll see it used in quite a few places in Boot 2. This line number stuff is something called origin. So in boot we have this new interface called origin, and it's pretty dumb. In fact, it doesn't really do anything other than say it's got a toString that implements something sensible, and then we have some subclasses of it. So we have text resource origin, for example, that'll tell you the resource and the location, which is the line and column number, and various other ones. But every time we load a file now, a YAML file or a properties file, we're able to track precisely where a particular value is coming from. So this origin gets used in a few places. We'll see it later when we look at the actuator endpoint. If you've got like validation errors, then we often show the origin as like, you know, to say like this string is empty and the value that I found it in is in this file, this line and column number. So we think this kind of feature is actually going to be quite useful. Okay, so let's fix up these things. So that one can just go away, and this one needs to change to spring.security.user.password equals magic. Okay. Because we've migrated these as well, this property migrator thing, you know, it doesn't come for free. It's got to do some logic. It's got to look through all your properties and kind of work out if you're using any deprecated ones. So once you're kind of happy and you've migrated, it's best to remove it so it's not kind of doing any extra work. So I'm just going to get rid of it again. All right, so let's just check this thing still works. Yeah. So we start up, we've not got the generated password, which is good. But what I want to do is I want to fix this, clear that a sec. I want to fix the fact that, 2 seconds. So I want to fix the fact that it's asking for this login, because in the old version, like cities and city were open, and I want to make that the same with the new version. Now, in Spring Boot 1.5 kind of security configuration, we tried to do quite a lot for you. So we tried to kind of split the configuration and say, okay, that's actuator, we'll configure that for you, but you can do your own configuration, and you have to order things to get them in the right place, so that ours would run before or after yours, and it kind of worked, but it would quickly get confusing. So in Boot 2, we've decided that we're just going to do away with all that, and we effectively, if you have security on the class path, we consider that to be a signal that you want to enable web security in exactly the same way as you would if you were just doing Spring Security manually. And if you want to kind of configure things, then it's down to you, and you're going to have to create your own security configuration. So I'm going to create a new class called Security Configuration. And I'm going to make it a configuration, no, not conditional, a configuration. And I'm going to make use of Spring's Web Security Configurer Adapter. So Spring Security's Web Security Configurer Adapter. Okay. So this is the way you kind of traditionally set up your Spring security configuration, and the way I personally like to do this kind of stuff is I like to just have one of these, because I find it difficult enough to set up security without having things kind of spread across multiple classes. So what we've tried to do in Boot 2 is give you kind of helper classes that you can use when you just want to have a single security configuration. So I need to configure my HTTP security, and I want to change it so that my actuator endpoints are open. Now, a couple of tips. If you look at the superclass of this one, you'll see this is what Spring Security does by default, which is kind of helpful. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to use that as a kind of basis of mine. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, I need a request that's going to any actuator endpoint. I want to say you need to be logged in, and any other web endpoint I'm just not bothered about, so you can just access it. So I need to somehow have something that matches against the actuator endpoint. And Spring Security's got this request matches method that takes a request matcher. So in Spring Boot, what we've done is, rather than like try to give you multiple configurations, we give you this endpoint request object. Endpoint request. So there's two versions. The one I want is the servlet one. An endpoint request gives you a quick way to build up matches that match actuator endpoints. So in this case, I want to say, if you're going to any of my actuator endpoints, then I'm going to make you authenticated. And if you're going to, obviously you can't spell, and if you're going to any request, then I'm going to say permit all for this one. So I'm going to change the Spring Security defaults and say permit all. And then I'll carry on with form login and HTTP basic. So let's just make that a bit easier to read. Authorize request. Okay. So let's see, does this work? So I'm going to go back to cities. So there we go. You can see this time our cities endpoint works. Let's have a look at London again. That one works. And let's hit our info actuator endpoint. See if that one works. And we have got an error here. So we're not getting a security exception. We're getting a 404, which is saying this endpoint isn't found, which is interesting. And the reason that this endpoint isn't found is because we've moved them all. So again, in Boot 1.5, we kind of discovered our mistake a bit too late, but all of the actuator endpoints kind of sat off the root, so you could do info or env or beans, and it worked kind of fine. But there was a few problems with it. One, it was kind of hard to secure. These things would sneak in, and you weren't sure. And two, it became very hard for us, as developers of Spring Boot, to add additional endpoints that we might need without worrying that they might clash with endpoints that you've already defined. So in order to fix that, in Boot 2, we've moved them all. So they're all now under actuator. So if I hit actuator/info, I'm getting the login because that matches our security configuration. And if I log in, then we're getting that information back out again. So that the info endpoint is now working. Let's have a quick check of env as well. And okay, interestingly, env is still not there. Why is that? Well, if we look at actuator, we get a list of all of the endpoints that we've got set up. So this is a HAL formatted JSON structure. And you could do this in Boot 1.5, but you had to add a dependency on Spring Hatios, and you had to set up this actuator path yourself. And in Spring Boot 2, you don't need to do that. It's all kind of done for you, and it works out the box even if you don't have the extra dependency. And you can see here that we've got like three. We've got the actuator 1, health, and info. And we're missing like a whole ton. And the reason we're missing those is because we've decided to switch them off by default, so that you don't accidentally expose information that you didn't want to. So if we want to enable them again, what we need to do is we need to add a property. So and the property that we want to add is management. Management.endpoints. Hang on. yeah, sorry, this one. So management.endpoints.web.exposure, and then you can see there's two. You can have an include and exclude set. So I'm going to change the include one to star, which is just going to enable everything. So you can see how you could easily have like an include of star and an exclude of like beans. So you want everything except beans, or if you want to be like more precise, you can just list the ones that you want to include and not worry about the exclude ones. And let's just restart again. And if I hit actuator now, you can see we have like all of our endpoints back again, which is good. And let's have a quick look at the endpoint.
Phil, while you're doing that, I just want to say that Phil's code will be available after the session. A number of people have been asking. And we'll address your questions at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, if there's anything that's not clear, Peter, shout so that I can, like if there's anything that people are confused about, shout and I'll try and address it as we go, but otherwise we'll do them all at the end. Right, so this is the endpoint, and I wanted to point out that the JSON is slightly different here. So we've taken a chance to kind of organize our JSON in a much more kind of sane way. So here now we have property sources are listed as a list, which is nice. And we also have this origin stuff again. So like if you look at any particular property, like info.app.name, you can see the value and where it came from. So it's saying I came from this class path resource, right down to the line and column number that it was declared at. And you can also dig into an individual value, which is nice. So I could say, hey, where did this particular value come from? What did you do to find it? And it's going to tell me, okay, the value is this, and this is where I got it from. But also, these are all the property sources that I tried along the way. So I tried all of these, and they didn't have it. So if you have, with Spring Boot, it's easy to override properties. So you can override like an environment variable, for instance. You can have something in your properties file, and you declare an environment variable that changes it. And that's nice, but sometimes it can be a little bit like confusing as to where did this thing actually come from. So this little endpoint gives you a nice way to kind of find that out. I can see all the ones that tried, the fact they didn't return anything, and then the one that did is my application properties file. I think we have like a fully working application again. Let me see if there's anything else I want to show you before moving off from that. No, let's go ahead and migrate this now to make it a little bit more reactive. So I'm going to take what we've done and I'm going to migrate it to a reactive application. But before I do that, I want to just show you some something interesting that I think is worth kind of discussing when we come on to the later section. So I'm going to add a couple of breakpoints. I've got my city controller, and I've added a breakpoint on the all method, and I've got my city class, and I've added a breakpoint on get name. I'm going to start this app again in debug mode. Okay, and then I'm going to hit my cities endpoint and show you what's going on. So what I want you to look at is the threads. So the threads in a Spring Boot blocking application, you can see we have more than fit on my page, and the majority of them are these HTTP NIO 8080 ones. So these are threads that Tomcat has created. And if we look at the way this application is currently working, you can see that my city controller is hit and it's using exec1 thread. And if I just carry on running, now my all method is still on exec1, and my get name methods are being called also on exec1. So you can see get name, get name, get name, get name, get name, and then our data comes back again. So that thread, this exec1 thread in this case, the Tomcat thread, is handling that request from start to finish. Okay. Let's migrate this app gradually to Reactive, and I'm going to start by just migrating the data bit. So Spring MVC will support reactive return types and do its best to kind of deal with them for you, which means we can do this like conversion in two parts. The first part I'm going to do is the data. So I want to change MongoDB, and I want to change it to a reactive application. So all of the starters that we've got in Spring Boot, for the data starters, if there is reactive support available, then there's a reactive equivalent. So I just need to change this starter to Spring Boot starter data MongoDB reactive. And if I save this application here and look at the dependencies, the one that I want to show is hopefully reactive streams. Yeah, so we have a reactive streams import that's now coming in, and somewhere in this list is project reactor as well, which is the way that we like to kind of work with reactive applications. So I'm now going to change my repository to make use of these new data types. My repository at the moment has got these two methods, and if I call find all, then basically this comes back as a fully populated list, all ready to roll. And if I call find by name ignoring case, I get like a single one again, like completely ready. And what I want to do is I no longer want to return the thing. I want to return something that will provide the thing when it's ready. So I want to be non-blocking. If I call find all, I want to get something back immediately, and that's something I want to be able to listen to, and it will tell me when the data is available. So I want to change this one to something called a flux, and I want to change this one to something called a mono. Okay, so what are flux and mono? Flux and mono are both implementations of this thing called a publisher. So this is a reactive streams specification. So this is like a consortium that came together and tried to work out a way of getting reactive applications to be interoperable with each other. And it's a pretty simple like interface here. You can just subscribe to it, and it will tell you basically when data is available or if there's been an error. Reactor kind of, so this is a reactive streams type. These are project reactor types. They're kind of helpful implementations, and a mono is something that represents kind of 0 or 1 results, and a flux represents a kind of stream of results, potentially kind of infinite. So you can see like this is going to return more than one city, and this is going to return just a single city or no city at all. Okay. Well, we're kind of okay, but we've broken our city controller now. So what we need to do here is change our city controller to actually return the appropriate types as well. I said Spring MVC can kind of deal with them, so I want to return a flux from this one, and I want to return a mono from this one. And we're almost working, except we don't have this stream function on flux. So find all is returning a flux and not a list, so we don't have streams. Now the good news is that why you'd want to use these flux and monotypes is they have like a whole bunch of kind of useful operations that you can do on them. So this kind of is a really nice programming model. It's very similar to the kind of streams API, but much more rich. So I can just get rid of stream because there's a filter method that we can use directly. And I no longer need to collect it because I'm just returning the flux anyway. So that's our new code. So again, like this is saying, find all the things, filter it for the USA, and return that straight out as a flux immediately, and let Spring MVC deal with it. Okay, see if that works. No. Why not? Okay. Occasionally, for some unknown reason, embedded Mongo goes wrong. So when I was doing this earlier, it was falling over. It seems like if you just run it again, it's happy. So if you see me restart the app because of an error, it's because embedded Mongo's got itself in a bit of a tiz. All right, let's re-hit this. Okay, so we're working again. Let's have a quick look at what's going on. We have, you can see all that. We still have all these threads. In fact, we have slightly more threads now. And something interesting is going to happen. The first hit that we've got here, where we're, oh, what, have I missed it? Yeah, sorry, I've missed it. Let me do that again. I managed to lose the breakpoint. Okay, refresh. So the first hit here, where we're doing the city controller method, you can see this time we're in Tomcat thread 3. Okay, if I carry on, the get name method is in thread 4. So unlike the first application where everything kind of happened in the same thread, we're doing like a thread jump here. And the reason for that is that Spring MVC is doing its best to deal with these reactive types, and it's using servlets async support. So it's doing a start async when it returns the first data, and then the actual processing is being handled in a later other thread. So it's basically doing the best it can to make this application a reactive application. But we are not like fully reactive at this point. So I say Spring MVC is doing its best, but what we really want to do is switch to a completely non-blocking server. So I'm going to change my Spring Boot Starter Web to something else. I'm going to use Spring Boot Starter WebFlux. Was there a question, Peter?
No, it's
Okay.
interesting actually hearing from Rawson lately on how many customers have been actually quite interested in the incremental move to reactive that we can offer. In fact, I have a blog that talks a little bit more about that from some of Rawson's comments that I'll talk about at the end. But I'm really happy you were showing this. Thanks, because I think a lot of the existing Spring MVC customers are kind of curious about how do you sort of edge towards reactive rather than just jump in with both feet. So I think it's really great you showed that. Thank you.
Okay, cool. There's a little bit later, if we get to it, there's we've got some load testing that we do, and we make use of a classical web client, which is in the framework, which is like a really nice way of doing remote REST calls. So I think a lot of people might start with that. It's kind of a nice way to get your feet wet with these reactive types without necessarily even converting your app to a kind of fully reactive style.
Exactly. Yep. Web client for the win. Yep.
All right. So where did I get to? What have I done? I've changed this dependency. I've saved it. ID is updated. Let's have a look at my dependencies here, and let's search for Tomcat. And you'll see we don't have Tomcat. And let's search for servlet. We don't have servlet. And then let's search for Netty. And we do have Netty. So in Spring Boot 2, the default server that we give you if you want a WebFlux application is Netty. And you're still welcome to kind of switch that out and use Tomcat, but we don't work with the servlet APIs when you're doing a WebFlux application. So you don't actually need the servlet APIs if you're doing a kind of WebFlux application. You shouldn't interact with them. The way that Tomcat works is we have this kind of small bridge that fits on top of it. Okay, so that seems to be working. Let's see if our app actually runs.
Just curious, Phil, while we're waiting, is the incremental switch, is that also available with Jersey? Web client is, how does that work? Does that work with Jersey?
No, depends on
Yeah,
what you're doing. Like if you can't return, as far as I'm aware, you can't return reactive types from a Jersey resource.
Okay. Okay.
But you can still use like web client within your Jersey code if you would like, if you were handling something that needed to go and do remote calls itself. So you could still use reactive types, but you can't return them in the same way that MVC can deal with them.
Okay, that's what I thought. It wasn't quite the same parity. All right, thank you so much.
Now we've got a problem here. So our applications, although it's compiling, it's like falling in a big heap because the security configuration is somehow using a servlet type, and that makes kind of sense because the this kind of design, this adapter thing actually has always used servlet types. So in order to migrate this application to a fully reactive app where we don't have these servlet types, we can't use the same web security configure adapter. We need to kind of change this class to something else. So I need to replace the security configuration with something else. And in this case, I just don't need the adapter at all. I need to return something from a bean. So I'm going to change this to a bean method. I'm going to make it a public method, and I'm going to return a new Spring security type called security web filter chain. Okay, and let's make this a rename that method as well because it's now a bean, so it's become something sensible. Okay. And I need to change this from HTTP security to server HTTP security. So these are like reactive equivalents of the Spring security types. Authorized requests no longer exists, so I need to change that to something else. It's actually authorized exchange now. Request matchers is no longer called request matchers, it's called matchers, I think, or matcher, matchers. This type here, I said there was two equivalents, so I'm using the servlet one. I need to change that to the reactive one. And the API is the same, but it returns one of these. These matches now take our server web exchange matches, so they're kind of similar, but just a different API that doesn't use servlet types. So that looks good. This is not a request anymore, it's an exchange. And the rest remains, except I need to return something. So what I actually return is the result of this. And build. Okay, hopefully that's right. Let's give it a go. That's just my embedded Mongo going wrong again. Right, these work. There we go. So this is now a reactive application, and it's doing exactly the same thing. So some interesting points. First of all, we didn't need to actually change this city controller at all once it was returning these reactive types. So a lot of people don't realize that the REST controller annotations and the mapping annotations like get mapping, etc. These are all part of a library called Spring Webb, I think. Let me just double check. Yeah, so they're part of Spring Webb. So they're not actually part of Spring MVC. And Spring WebFlux makes use of exactly the same annotations. So you can use exactly the same kind of code and things just work. The only thing you need to be careful of is that you return types that are either like immediately available or are reactive types, so that you don't block. I'm going to run this app in debug mode. And then just refresh that again. And let's look at the threads this time. So another interesting point. So our stack is way deeper, but our threads are like way less. So we actually have reactor HTTP threads here. So you can see we've got 8 of those. And then the one that we're being served on is HTTP NIO2. Let's just carry on running. And then the remaining ones all happen on this Netty event loop thing. So they all just happen straight away. And each of those calls, the system can deal with other things in between them. It's like totally non-blocking in the way that it works. Okay, anything I've missed? Let me just double check. Oh yeah, security. So I mentioned that there are reactive equivalents of most of the projects. Spring Security is quite interesting because it's reactive and non-reactive support is in the same package, so you don't actually need to add a separate starter for that. There's no separate like dash reactive security module to use. Yeah, I think that's all good. Let's finish up. We've got about 5-10 minutes left, and I want to end by showing you something else that's new, and that's Micrometer support. So let's just run this up again. Yeah. If we go back to our actuator endpoints again and look at metrics. Oh yeah, this is a new login screen because we're using WebFlux now, but the details are the same. So our metrics stuff has changed significantly in Boot 2, and we're no longer providing any kind of metrics library ourselves. Instead, we're relying on a project called Micrometer. And you can see that out of the box, if you hit metrics, you kind of get this list of things that you can find out more about. So let me pick HTTP server requests, for instance, and I can dig into that one a little bit more. And I get like basic in-memory metrics for this stuff, which is kind of, it's nice. You can still hit the JSON and like look at stuff if you want. But one of the real nice parts about Micrometer is it has like really good integration with lots of different libraries like Datadog, lots of third-party ones. And what I want to do is show you Prometheus. So I'm going to change this app and I'm going to add a new runtime dependency. And I'm going to call it Reactor. No, not Reactor, when we're talking about Micrometer. Registry. So these are all of the, you can see here, these are all the registries that Micrometer supports. So I'm just going to pick the Prometheus one, make it a runtime dependency. Now the way that Prometheus works is it kind of calls your app. So it hits an endpoint and tries to get some data. So I need to tweak my security configuration, otherwise Prometheus isn't going to be able to find it. So I'm going to add another matcher, another endpoint request matcher, and this time to a specific endpoint. And Micrometer actually will set one up for me for Prometheus, so I just need to spell it correctly. So give me Prometheus. Right. I don't know why all these metric tools need to be so difficult to spell. So I'm going to do that as permit all. So I'm just saying, like, you can hit this endpoint, that's fine, and all the other endpoints are still authenticated. Now, we do actually have a method in here. So this matcher has got a nice method called excluding, which means that we should be able to use like endpoint to any endpoint excluding Prometheus. Unfortunately, in 2.0, we for some reason made that method package private by mistake, so you'll have to wait for 2.01 before you can actually use that one, but this will do the same job. Okay, I want to do a few other things. I want to give some labels to this thing. So Micrometer is multi-dimensional metrics, which means that you can kind of give things labels, and you can slice your application in various different ways to find out, which metrics are behaving. Like a common one is data center. You might say, let me look at all the successful requests from, the US region 1 versus US region 2. And I'm going to use a meter registry customizer, which is a special type that you can use to kind of customize meter registries. So I'm just going to create a bean of that. I'm going to add some common tags that I want in everything. Let's return an implementation, which is just a registry, gets passed in. And I'm going to do registry.config .common tags. Let's add some tag pairs. I'm going to add application as one and webinar. Okay. So that should just add these tags to everything that Micrometer does. A few more things that I need to do just very quickly are I want to add some, I want to change some properties. So let's do percentiles histogram. So I'm going to set up some additional things. So this is like a setting that's basically saying this is the prefix and this is the name of the metric. So HTTP server requests, and I want to just send a percentile histogram information back with that, and I want to send an SLA as well. Let's say one. Okay. All right. I think we're good. Let's run this again. And I'm going to go back to our actuator endpoints and make sure that we've got a Prometheus one. So we have got a Prometheus endpoint, and if we click this, you'll see this is the data that actually Prometheus scrapes. So Prometheus will hit this and find out some stuff. So let's maybe hit cities a few times and refresh that. You'll see that these values kind of change. Well, maybe you won't, but they do change. It's just we've got so many that it's hard to see. Let's go ahead. There's I've got a couple of scripts here. I've got a couple of Docker things set up. So I'm going to start Prometheus for real. And I'm going to start Grafana, which is like a nice dashboard. And let's see if we can hit that. So I've got a dashboard set up. So here you can see the kind of information that Micrometer can provide out the box. We get like heap information, what have you. Let's make it a bit finer. That's 5 minutes. Okay, and I've got the final thing I want to do is hit this load tester. So I've got a little application here. Very straightforward. It uses the web client stuff that I was talking about earlier, and it just hits the city's endpoint and then randomly sends like a bunch of requests. So if I do, this is Spring application, it's using some Spring Boot starters, but it's not actually a Spring Boot application. It's just a main method, just to show you the kind of, you can like use this stuff in your own code even if you're not using Spring Boot applications. Let's do target load test. So this is now pumping data through to that thing. So if I go back over here, yeah, you can see that we've got some stuff kind of coming in. I don't know what's going on there. It doesn't look quite right. Well, you can see it's stressing the CPU and the threads. I was expecting, oh yeah, here we go. So we've got some latency information here coming in as well. One kind of interesting note of this is that you can see that the average time is like really good, but if you look at the percentile times, that some of your users are not getting that average experience. So it's something to bear in mind with metrics, that the average is not always a good measure. and you should check out some talks by John Schneider about that, because he goes into a lot more detail on this Micrometer stuff. And I think that is it. That is all I wanted to show you. So I'm happy to answer any Q&A if there is any.
Phil, thank you. Yes, there's a ton. Before we get started and just jump right into the Q&A, I want to say a few things for everyone. You know, I saw a few comments and feedback from the audience about sort of why we're just sort of jumping into, you know, migrating a Spring Boot app without a lot of context. There's tons of other context available. If you want to read the launch blog on the Spring.io, Phil's launch blog on the Spring.io website. I also just published some content. If you look in the attachment and links section now in your user interface, this is a good time to do that. There's some related content on, you know, Spring Boot internals, and at the very bottom there's a release blog that goes into a little bit more detail about some of these incremental scenarios from myself and a little bit of intel from Ross and Stoyanchev. Also, there's a bunch of other resources like the GitHub repo for the demo Phil's been showing today is linked to from there. You can always come back to the same webinar URL you used to register and get these as attachments. But since you're here, this is a good time now to click through to those things, bookmark them, or open them in another tab. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to drop off and go into the feedback from audience tab and let Phil and myself and Madhura and Andy Wilkinson know how we're doing. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We've got about 10 minutes. We're trying to just cherry pick the best questions, to be honest. And what we'll do is we will put all of your questions into a Google Doc and answer them over the course of the next 48 or 72 hours or so, and then post them as an attachment to the webinar replay. Again, the webinar replay is at the same URL you used to register, and it will be live later this afternoon even. So for anyone who's been asking questions about recorded content or looking for Phil's source code, you know, that should address all of those. As well as, you know, if you feel you just jumped into the deep end of the pool with a walkthrough of how to upgrade a simple app, and you don't really understand the context around Spring Boot 2.0, I'd really encourage you to read Phil's launch blog on Spring.io, and then my blog on Pivotal.io that just went live this morning. And again, the links for those are in the attachments and links section. If you're looking to get a hold of software, you can find the Maven and Gradle coordinates on the Spring Boot project page, which is highly Googleable. If for some reason you are on a military network or a closed network of some sort behind 200 layers of proxy servers and you need an HTTP download, we don't make it easy for you to do that, but you can get them from our nightly build server, which is located at repo.spring.io, I believe. Phil, did I get that right? I think it's repo.spring.io, yeah?
Say that again, for the jars?
For the nightly builds. Actually, I'm just checking that
repo.spring.io/snapshot will give you the nightlies.
Snapshot. Okay, cool. And you can get an HTTP download from there if you're like stuck on a military network or closed network. All right, so let's get off to some of the questions. Thanks for your patience. Some of the first ones up, and Phil, we're going to try to go through these fairly breezy. You know, either Madhura or Andy or yourself might be jumping in to answer some of these, but we're going to try to keep the answers short so we can get through a number of them. A few people asked about Spring Cloud, about when Spring Boot 2.0 will be supported by, when Spring Cloud is going to be using Spring Boot 2.0. And the answer to that is that, Andy, I believe you said there was a milestone 8 that already does, and then we'll have a GA sometime next month. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Finished milestone 8 was released just a few days ago, I think, built on top of Spring Boot 2.0, and then there's some release candidates to come, and then I think they're aiming for mid-April for the finishly release.
Perfect. So all you Spring Cloud users, you'll be able to get a 2.0, Boot 2.0 compatible version quite quickly. Next question is, I think this is for Phil. Phil, does the new binder functionality work with the @configuration properties annotated components? If we're using @configuration properties, do we need to do anything to upgrade?
Yeah, so the new binder stuff is what's used like to bind those configuration properties. You, generally speaking, won't need to do anything to upgrade because like the input and output should be the same. It's just the mechanism we use in the middle has changed. The only exception is if you're using environment variables, the format of the environment variables is a lot stricter than it used to be. So just there's a wiki page that kind of describes this in a bit more detail, but just take care that basically your dots in your property name have to be underscores, and you can no longer have underscores between the case changes in a camel case like name. But other than that, it should be transparent.
Awesome, thanks. Next question was, can you still disable the web security if the property has gone away? I'm not entirely sure. That feels like a question fragment, but does that make sense to you?
It's probably a question that Madura might be able to answer. I think it's...
Yeah, so the security.enable flag has gone away, and that was because it was confusing to a lot of people because it only disabled Boot's auto-configured security, but not if you added your own security. If you do have Spring security on the class path and you still want to, say, disable it for tests, you can use the exclude auto-configuration flag. Or Spring security also provides a bunch of test helpers. So you can do like a with mock user and use those instead of having to disable security. Awesome.
Hey, thanks, Madhura. Another question was, does Spring Boot 2 currently support WebLogic 12c? Any issues with it that you're aware of? I think we could generalize this to also just talk about the other containers that we test on.
Andy, question for Andy, definitely. He's the
question for Andy. Paging Andy in Isle WebLogic.
Thanks, Phil. It's always a pleasure to talk about app servers. So if you're deploying a Spring Boot WAR file, Spring Framework 5 and therefore Spring Boot 2.0 require a Servlet 3.1 compatible container, which I believe the newer versions of WebLogic 12c support Servlet 3.1, so you should be fine there, and recent versions of any other container will work, and we test on WebSphere, Liberty, Glassfish, Tommy, a separate standalone Tomcat as part of our build. So we've got reasonably good coverage of various Servlet 3.1 containers, but it should work on any of them that claim Servlet 3.1 compatibility.
Awesome. Which ones do we explicitly test with?
WebSphere, Liberty, Tom EE, Tomcat, Pyala, I think. Did I say Glassfish? Is it those four or five? And then obviously on the three embedded containers that we support as well, Tomcat, Jetty, and Undertow.
Of course. Yep. Okay, great. Hey, thanks for that, Andy. Really appreciate it. Let's see, a couple other questions, and I'm not sure who this one is for, but question was, is there a Spring Boot YAML migrator? As our company, and in our company, we usually use YAMLs rather than properties.
So the properties migrator, I assume that this person's talking about the properties migrator dependency, and that actually works.
I think so. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that works actually at the Spring property level. It's not tied to properties files. So yeah, if you have a YAML source, it just gives you exactly the same output. It just points to the line in the YAML file rather than the properties file. So yeah, that works fine.
I see. Okay, got it. Okay. Let's see. We're actually doing okay on time. So those are some of the critical ones. There was
one thing that I missed during the presentation that I just wanted to briefly point out. The actuator stuff. You may have noticed that actuator kind of worked when we switched to a reactive stack, and we have this brand new abstraction now around actuator endpoints, and that also means that that'll work with Jersey. So if you've had to jump through some hoops in the past with 1.5 where you're writing a Jersey app, but you have Spring MVC so you can have actuators, you can drop Spring MVC entirely now, and things will just work.
Got it. Okay. Cool. There was one question about, it was a bit short, but the question was literally just, what about Jetty over Tomcat? And Andy, I think you had a comment or two you wanted to say on that one.
I guess this was a question about using WebFlux on top of an embedded servlet container. So Phil showed the app running on top of Tomcat. And the clever kind of adapting stuff that Spring MVC does to deal with mono and flux on top of a servlet container. You can do that on top of any container. It's just using the servlet 3.1 async stuff. You can actually even do a kind of a full WebFlux app on top of Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow, any of the embedded containers, because we hook into the servlet, the async stuff in the servlet API. So then the question of Jetty versus Tomcat just comes down to your personal preference, really. What container you're most familiar with and which one you prefer.
Yep. And I think along that same lines, there was a question about, because I think you're kind of halfway there already, right? And the question was, what about, is there no servlet support for reactive web apps? What's the equivalent? And you and I were discussing this in the chat, saying how servlet and WebFlux are fundamentally different APIs, but
that pretty much covers it. If you're writing a WebFlux app and you want to use the non-blocking stuff, then you can't write servlets because servlet IO is inherently blocking. You have to deal with input streams and things. So the equivalent, I guess, would either be the annotation-based programming model that Phil showed using REST controller and get mapping and whatnot, or there's the functional side of WebFlux, which Phil didn't show, but there's a blog post about it on the blog, and I'm sure we can add a link to that, that shows another alternative programming model if you're not fond of annotations.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. Phil, is it possible to export that Graph-Alnon dashboard configuration so it can be shared?
It's actually part of that. It's in that GitHub repo. So
it is. Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple. If you go to the GitHub repo and look in the Micrometer folder, there's the load tester and some scripts to start up both that Grafana and the Prometheus, and there's a JSON file, but it just imports. So you just have to run a couple of scripts, and they will basically, it will start up a Docker container and import that dashboard, so you can do what you want with it.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for literally one more question, and I think it's time to wrap up. And I think this one is interesting. Phil and Andy and Madhura, if we have one more. Is there a Spring Boot starter JPA reactive dependency? In particular, is there support for paging and also with the JPA API?
No. So okay. The Hibernate and, as far as I'm aware, like again, it's like the fundamental difference between WebFlux and WebMVC is, Hibernate is currently very much built on there is no like reactive JDBC as yet. There are some drivers, like I think Postgres has got one, like a reactive support, but there's no reactive JDBC, so there's no way of building a reactive Hibernate, and there's no reactive JPA, so there's no way I think that Spring Data can currently offer that.
Someone was actually asking. Sorry.
Go on.
No, somebody was actually asking about the Oracle reactive JDBC driver efforts as well, and I think those are still pretty nascent, and just feed directly into what you were saying. So I think we got two questions there with one. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I believe that that there are some efforts underway to start, in Oracle with a reactive JDBC, and my guess is that the order you'll see things in is probably like once that happens, I imagine Spring Data will be able to offer like JDBC star support before JPA catches up. But it's a fairly
50-second warning. We're literally going to get we're running out of time for questions. So folks, what we're going to do is if we didn't get your question, don't worry. we internally will sort of share that in a Google Doc and work on the answers over the next 48, 72 hours, and we'll post them as an attachment. All the ones that we can't answer, we'll do our best to make sure if you entered your question that we will get to it, and will be posted as a attachment to the webinar replay, which is again at that same URL you used to register. So listen, thank you very much everyone for joining. Phil, really appreciate it. Madhura, Andy, really thanks a lot for jumping in and helping with field all the questions. And we hope you go out and build some amazing things with Spring Boot. And I think we're in a great position. So we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks for coming.